My grandfather Steve died a few days ago. I always looked up to him. He was always a very positive person. He worked as a pilot for one of the oldest airlines in the United States, so he used to travel a lot. During one of his travels, he met a woman named Grace, who was to become my grandmother. They quickly fell in love and got married a little over a year after meeting each other in 1975 when he was 27. A year later, they had their first and only child, my father. Grace stayed at home in the suburbs of Orlando, Florida, while Steve flew across the United States and to Europe for his work. But in 1981, when my father was only 5 years old, Grace abandoned them. Steve didn't have any family. His parents had passed away some years earlier, and he was an only child, so to take care of my father, he quit his job with the airline and instead became a flight instructor so he could stay at home. Steve never appeared upset or depressed about Grace leaving, even joking that she no longer wished to grace them with her presence. We never knew whether this positivity was genuine or if he was simply acting like that as a way of protecting my dad. He encouraged my father to pursue the things he loved, whether it be school subjects, sports, jobs, or girls. Every single family holiday, Dad would tell us the story of how Grandpa Steve encouraged him, pushed him to ask out our mom, which turned out to be a great decision. They got married in 1996 and had 4 children, me, my sister, and my 2 brothers. Grandpa Steve played a large role in raising us, too. Babysitting when our parents were working, oftentimes cooking for us, taking us to football, baseball, and basketball games, coming to my baseball games and my little brother's football games, etc. He was very present in our lives, and we were all very, very close. In his later years, he developed heart disease, and hospital trips became more common after that. This year, he finally decided enough was enough and refused another operation. We went to visit him in the hospital as often as we could. He would give us parts of our inheritance before he actually passed away, so he could see how happy it would make us, he said. I was shocked when he gave me a set of keys and told me that his house was mine, for free. I thanked him profusely, and that evening I drove to my new home. I had been there often, so I was quite familiar with the rooms. I decided to look in the attic to see what kind of things he had stored up there. Most of it was pretty normal stuff. Boxes of old clothes, some old furniture. It was nice to see his old pilot uniform in one of the boxes. I also found a box filled with photo albums. I decided to take a look. There were a lot of pictures of Grandpa Steve and his travels, and a lot of him with Grace and my dad as a young boy. I took the box downstairs with me and spent all night looking through them. When I opened the last one, however, I found that it wasn't a photo album, but a scrapbook. Inside were little square pieces of fabric, all with a letter, date, and place written underneath it. V. 6/3/1973, Paris, France. A. 7/20/1973, Oklahoma City, Oklahoma. S. 9/12/1973, Toronto, Canada. The list went on. I never knew Grandpa was interested in fabric, so I decided to ask him about it the next time I visited him. When I walked into his hospital room the next time, carrying the scrapbook under my shoulder, I saw Grandpa Steve had a huge smile on his face from what I could only guess was nostalgia. My scrapbook, he said excitedly. Yes, I was hoping you would tell me about it. I didn't know you collected fabric. Well, he laughed. It isn't really about the fabric itself. It's about where the fabric came from. He smiled at me. I'm glad you found it. I don't have a lot of time left in this world, and I never told anyone about my collection. I'm glad I can finally tell someone so it won't be forgotten. He motioned for me to take a seat on the chair next to his bed, and I gave him the scrapbook. He opened it and flipped through the pages, still with a big smile on his face. He finally closed the book and let out a deep sigh. When I was young, the world was a violent place. Almost every man from my father's generation had fought in the war, and when I grew up, I heard about the war in Korea as well as, of course, due to the constant threat of communism. In my teenage years, the Vietnam War started, and with it came an incredible amount of war journalism. No war before Vietnam had quite as much news about it broadcast to the American people, especially if you don't count the propaganda used to build war support and sell bonds. I wanted to become a pilot for the U.S. Air Force, but my father forbade it. He pulled some strings and kept me out of the draft, and he warned me that if I ever volunteered, he would make life hell for me. So I became an airline pilot instead. Flying was exhilarating, and seeing places all across the Western Road was great. Besides landmarks and restaurants, I came across a lot of women. I, of course, as a young man, did my best to seduce as many of them as I could. After a while, however, one night stands lost the appeal they'd had before. The world was still a very violent place, and I was forbidden to participate. I felt left out. I couldn't join the military on account of my father, so I had to find a different way to join in on the violence. It started with Veronica in Paris. I met her in a bar. We got to talking, and when things got a little more passionate, I invited her to stay with me at my hotel. She agreed, and we started walking. I told her the quickest way was through a small alleyway, and when she followed me in there, I turned around, wrapped my hands around her lovely throat, and squeezed as hard as I could. She struggled, tried to kick me, scratched my face pretty good, but soon enough, her struggling stopped and she slumped to the ground. I wasn't sure what to do with her. I was in the middle of Paris, France, in a small alleyway with a woman I had just choked to death. As I looked around me, I saw a dumpster a little further into the alley and decided to dump her in there. I had picked her up, and when I was standing in front of the dumpster, her corpse slung over my shoulder, I suddenly realized I wanted a souvenir. I couldn't take an actual part of her body, of course. Even as a pilot, I still had to go through customs, so anything like that would immediately get noticed. I put her down and started ripping her dress until I had ripped off a small square. I put it in my pocket and decided to rip her clothes more to make it less noticeable than a small piece of her dress was missing. Ever since then, I planned ahead so I wouldn't be in a position like that ever again, in the middle of a major city with the corpse of someone I had just murdered. I was speechless, but he wasn't finished yet. Now, after that, I had made sure to hire a car for the few days I was staying in whatever city it was. Instead of inviting them to my hotel, I'd invite them to have a little drive with me, away from prying eyes, and then we drive out of town. I didn't always kill them the same way. Sometimes I'd strangle them, sometimes I'd break their neck. I could stab them if I wore short sleeves. One time, I pushed a woman out of my car while going 90 miles per hour into a fence. That was the most mangled corpse I've ever seen to this day. You wouldn't believe how hard it was to find a bit of clothing that wasn't covered in mud or blood. I couldn't believe the things he was describing to me. I couldn't believe he was laughing about it. This was a side of him I had never seen before. I thought anyone ever had seen before. I lived to tell about it. He still wasn't done talking. I always made sure to rip their clothes and bury them. Not in a shallow grave either, no. That's just begging to get them discovered. No, I put them in a solid 6 feet under grave, proper. That's why most of them have only ever been reported as missing. Only a few of the bodies were ever found, months, even years after I'd been there. I tell you, if you ever want to see something beautiful, look at a woman in the eyes as the life is flowing out of her. There's no lies left, no manipulation, no threat. Only beautiful truth. I couldn't say anything to him. I sat there speechless, just looking at that scrapbook and at him with a smile on his face. Finally, he said, "I'm glad to have been able to tell you this. It's nice to finally share my passion after all these years." After that, I got up and drove home. He died a day later. I couldn't bring myself to live in his house, knowing what he'd done, what kind of person he really was, so I put it up for sale. My siblings were very upset at the decision, but I didn't want to shatter their image of the great, positive, cheerful grandfather they had, so I told them nothing. I'm still not quite sure what bothers me the most about it. Is it knowing that my nice, sweet grandfather who practically raised me and my siblings was in reality a psychopathic serial killer? Is it because the scrapbook was filled up to the final page? Or is it because the last bit of fabric had G 8 12 1981 Orlando, Florida written underneath it? Hi, I'm Jared Lynch, janitor at Augusta Hospital, and I found this note while cleaning the morgue. To whomever may find and read this note, please reach out to my wife Gladys Williams or any of my children, Edward, Nikki, or William Koch. One of the nurses has been kind enough to give me some paper and a pencil, but I must still be discreet. Doctors are anal about objects entering my room. I am writing this with my left hand since my right arm is of no use anymore. It is difficult, but it's either writing it down or losing my mind. Ambrose is dead, and I am afraid I will soon follow. As you know, Ambrose and I never planned our yearly camping trip beforehand. We pack our stuff, I pick him up, and we drive until we run out of gas. This year we went northwest and ended up 2 miles outside of a place called Helmuth, where we set up our tent near a lake. The Helmuth people are kind, though not used to strangers. We got our supplies at a local market where the cashiers are nice and the beers are cheap. The first night we made our dinner on the little camping stove and told stories until the beers were finished. We spent the week fishing, hiking, and playing cards. The last day, we decided to spend an evening at a local pub, the Big Pool. Again, beer was cheap and the barkeep quite friendly. Alcohol seemed to loosen up the villagers. As the evening went on, the locals started telling us tall tales about the town. Some told us Helmuth was named after the pagan god Hel. Others that it was derived from the mouth of hell. Of course, these stories were more funny than true. I don't think anyone finished a story while containing their laughter or changing the plot halfway through into something else even more ludicrous. Except the last one. A teenager, student of Scandinavian culture, he claimed, said the town was named after Helmut, Viking war leader and victim of an angel's kiss. He said archaeologists found a stone slab with runic inscriptions which tell the story of Helmut, which might have taken place in Helmuth. Legend has it the town is a very early Viking settlement dating back to Leif Erikson. Helmut was appointed as chief of the village, but he died a few months later. One day, he stopped talking and never started again. His limbs slowly turned black. He went mad. In the end, he killed himself by smashing his head with a rock over and over again. Scholars aren't sure about the translation of the runic script. Although old, the script is rather clear except where it describes what made Helmut sick. Helmut's health declined after he ate something bright and white called an angel's kiss. According to the runes, that's either a fish, flower, or some sort of rock. It was a flower. Ambrose found it during one of our hikes days earlier. Of course, we didn't know at that time. It was a beautiful flower, bright, white, with blue on the edges. It gave off a very strong smell of hazelnut and honey. We had never seen such a thing in our lives. Looking back, that flower is the only logical reason for what happened yesterday. Ambrose woke up before me. When I got out of the tent, he tried to greet me. He failed. I remember the panic in his eyes, sheer panic. He couldn't speak. His throat had turned black up to the root of his tongue. That's when I was becoming aware of a prickling in my throat. I cleared it and spat. My saliva was thick and dark red. Whatever had happened to Ambrose was developing inside me too. I thrusted my finger down my throat and made myself vomit. Black. All black. Inside me was a thick black mess. I have no clear recollection of what I did next. I must have been on the verge of shock. We must have driven to Helmuth because I remember trying to find a doctor there. As amiable as the people were in the pub the night before, they were scared when they saw what had happened to us. You can't blame them. The black had reached Ambrose's mouth and I was bleeding from my nose. It was not a pretty sight. Someone must have called the hospital since eventually two ambulances and police cars came bursting through the streets. People in those hazmat suits pulled us into an ambulance each while the police kept onlookers at bay. In the hospital, we were immediately put in quarantine. Doctors came in and drew blood, a lot of blood. I felt faint not long afterwards. Communication with Ambrose was hopeless. He just stared up at the ceiling. Last night, Ambrose rammed his head against the metal bed frame. He bled to death. A Viking's death, apparently. The hazmats came in to clean him up. An hour ago, one of the hazmat doctors came to me. I have a fungus inside me. Probably got in via the nasal airway, she said, but flourished when it came into contact with my stomach acid. They don't know what kind of fungus they are looking for. All they know is that it's black and fuzzy. I asked if it eventually affects the brain. She said they don't know yet, but I have a dead friend and a dead Viking who support my claim. Shortly after her visit, I lost feeling in my right hand. Black is coming from under my nail beds. I catch myself drifting away, not thinking straight. I'll soon see Ambrose and Helmet. In Valhalla, maybe. I'm tired. Death comes. It smells of honey and hazelnuts. It's funny that in the beginning, a smell was all it took. Signed Anthony Hugh Coke.